It's a great pleasure to open this first standalone lecture of our 2025 programme. Our lecture series runs throughout the year, featuring leading historians who present cutting-edge research across the medieval, the early modern, and the modern periods. This evening, we're especially fortunate to have Dr Natasha Hodgson with us to speak about her important work on medieval women. So Natasha is Associate Professor in History and Director of the Centre for Research in History, Heritage and Memory Studies at Nottingham Trent University in the UK, and her research spans medieval and the early modern periods, with social and cultural history, with a particular focus on women, gender and masculinities. She's also involved in digital humanities projects, including work on the Domesday Book and 15th century genealogical rolls. Most recently, Natasha served as consultant for the British Library's exhibition, many of you will have seen this, Medieval Women in Their Own Words, and co-founded teachingmedievalwomen.org, which is a collaborative initiative to expand and revitalise the teaching of women's history in medieval studies in schools. Natasha is the author of Women, Crusading and the Holy Land in Historical Narrative, published by Boydell in 2017, and a co-editor of Crusading and Masculinities, published in 2019, Religion and Conflict in Medieval and Early Modern Worlds, 2020, and Miracles, Political Authority and Violence in Medieval and Early Modern History. She also serves as an editor for Nottingham Medieval Studies and for two prominent Routledge series, Themes in Medieval and Early Modern History and Advances in Crusades Research. In tonight's lecture, Natasha will be speaking on the topic Dangerous Journeys, Framing Women's Movement in the Medieval World. So please join me in warmly welcoming Natasha to our lecture tonight.
Thank you very much. And again, just to reiterate, thank you so much for coming out on this miserable February evening. I hope to brighten it a little bit for you with my nice bright dress. So in the first instance, thank you very much for the Royal Historical Society for this kind invitation to talk. To Emily for her organisational skills, and I hope she feels better soon. I'm sad she couldn't make it. And to Philip for stepping in, and also for the kind introduction from Emma. My talk today focuses on some kind of fairly common misperceptions, I think, both about the medieval world and about medieval women. And I think medieval society has often been misrepresented in the popular imagination as static, regressive and underdeveloped. Yet this period that we label medieval represents roughly 1,000 years of human history, during which seismic changes in ideas, technology, demography and cultures took place. By comparison, when looking at medieval women, popular interpretations still tend to reinforce accounts that reflect contemporary misogynies and sources, ones that highlight gendered restrictions on women's power and movement. For a long time, those who were considered able to break this mould were considered exceptional. Recent scholarship, however, especially in relation to queenship and female lordship, has successfully challenged these perceptions and argued for a shift in perception about how we view female power to recognise its extent and different manifestations. So, women's ability to move around the medieval world and its significance in terms of our understanding of women's experiences, though, hasn't quite yet been subject to the same lens. Women who left their homes and travelled are still often viewed as largely exceptional. Yet throughout the medieval period, patterns of movement and migration intensified, governed by local subsistence crises and other demographic factors, the growth of urban centres, and the search for new trade routes as well as lands to settle. In the Latin West, initiatives such as penitential pilgrimage and crusade brought further spiritual dimensions to this process, as well as increased visibility and justifications for women to take part in them. Many female travellers still faced criticism. Concerns were voiced about women's personal and spiritual safety, and even about dangers that women might pose to male travellers, of course. Yet, this did not prevent a substantial number of women from moving around the medieval world, and they continue to do so for a wide range of reasons. So just to give a broad overview of what we're going to talk about today, this lecture will argue that an expanded view of women's movement in medieval society needs to gain wider traction in order to help dislodge lingering perceptions that medieval women stayed at home. It will consider how and why women moved through the medieval world in a literal sense, often travelling long distances for social, economic and religious purposes, and consider the potential impact of those movements and the benefits of using movement as a framework. To illustrate this, I'm going to draw from some examples of my own research on women in relation to the Crusades in the Latin East, but also from the recently highlighted British Library Medieval Women exhibition, which I was very fortunate to get involved with as a consultant. But before I get to the exciting case studies, I will say my paper today has a rather lengthy preamble, and I'm going to apologise in advance for this. And this is because much of my work in recent months has focused on why we need to re-examine these traditional frameworks, especially in light of the situation in the general education system. It's been driven, at least in part, by current challenges facing history across the UK in school and academic environments, especially in pre-modern subjects, and the potential offered by the recent announcement of a curriculum review. I'm conscious of the very important role in this that the Royal Historical Society plays in advocating for history as a subject, especially through its 2024 report on valuing history and for its important work on race, ethnicity and equality. Thus, I hope this work is one that will be of interest to the current audience. And I also want to take the opportunity to reflect on the very positive experiences of working collaboratively with academic and school teaching colleagues as well as partner organisations. This isn't necessarily my research as such, this is research that people are working on collaboratively and engaging in as we speak. So, it may be a surprise to some to learn that despite over 50 years of scholarship in which academics have explored a wide range of methodologies to recover details about the lives of diverse medieval women, and irrespective of the clear public interest in medieval women demonstrated by the success of public histories, exhibitions, film, TV, media, fundamental misconceptions about medieval women still seem to loom large. People are surprised to discover that medieval women were powerful, that they managed estates, had considerable personal wealth, and took on leading roles in politics and warfare. Most often, medieval women are associated with the ideas of home, family, and private life in ways that meet much more modern expectations of such concepts, rather than the realities of medieval households. Overwhelming perceptions still seem to be that prior to the suffrage movement, women in pre-modern societies were excluded from power, that there is a general lack of evidence about them, and as a result, while we've got a few well-known examples of elite women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Elizabeth I, they are treated as exceptions rather than the rule. So why aren't things changing? I mean, as an academic historian, I go to schools a lot. I love talking to school kids, they're great. And I enjoy kind of having a room full of young people and talking to them, but there is only so far that kind of engagement can go, because you have a very small audience, captive audience, who then go on to do other things. Maybe one or two might end up studying history at university, you never know. But generally speaking, the impact that that kind of engagement has is fairly limited. And so I think that a watershed moment for me came in 2022 when we had the Society for the Study of the Crusades and the Latin East conference in Royal Holloway, where I was invited to give a talk on my work on women and crusading to a continuing professional development day of teachers, about 60-odd school teachers, and also present were history representatives from all three English exam boards, OCR, AQA and EdXL. And we had a really fruitful discussion, which actually the penny dropped, and I began to understand some of the real problems that we are facing in terms of trying to get this content into schools. Following this meeting, a group of academics and teachers set up a collaborative project, the Teaching Medieval Women project, and this seeks to link cutting-edge historical research with teaching pedagogy in order to provide free, open access resources to teachers and to support both knowledge building and co-create materials for the classroom. But even on starting this project, we had a series of initial challenges. First and foremost, there's a general lack of current data about what type and how much women's history is being taught at school. Secondary history teaching faces a series of limitations to introducing change, including the topics, scope and content that are currently set by exam boards at GCSE and A-level. Key Stage 3, ages 11 to 13, for those not in the know, is a little bit more flexible and could be a target area, but it's still governed by a very traditional and England-focused national curriculum. Further, teachers often raise the issue that because women's history does not feature in assessments at GCSE and A-level, this is where they couldn't justify spending time teaching women's history if it wasn't going to get them the results. So, with the help of an amazing research assistant, Catherine Gower, we set to work having a look at the last 2 years of assessments. So we did 2022 and 2023, just looking at the medieval questions, and we published our interim findings for this. You can find it on Zenodo, just in time for the curriculum review call for evidence that came about in November last year. But we've continued that work to look now at all history topics. We've only got 2023 done thus far. It's taken a long time, but these figures, I think, give a clear and rather damning picture of what the state of women's history in current assessments are at schools. So, in 2023, of 991 assessment questions processed, students were directed to discuss women in 6%, men in 37%. Only 2 of those 991 instances related to medieval topics. Of 355 named historical individuals mentioned in questions, 325 were men and 30 were women. And in medieval topics, only 3% were women. Finally, looking at secondary historians, of 163 historians mentioned by name, 142 were men, 21 were women, and no female historians were mentioned in medieval topics. So, and if we break this down even further, I'm not sure if it's a little bit blurry, but you can see this is a problem across the board. We have issues really with the representation of women. First of all, in these questions where women are directed to discuss women or men in their answers, it's broken down by medieval, early modern and modern, cross period. Nothing there for medieval, which just makes me so sad. And then the number of instances of named individuals in questions by exam type and period there for you as well, just to soak that in for a minute. Now we've raised this issue with the exam board representatives, obviously, and we're working together to bring change. So the picture is not completely bleak. But they're not the only limiting factors. Assessment is one factor, but not the only one. Some of those raised by the teachers that have come to our sessions can broadly be kind of gathered together under some of this. At the moment, they have very content-heavy modules. So if they are going to include more stuff about women, what are they going to take away? Is a big question. The fact that they don't have time, support, resources to do this kind of thing. Nobody really wants to invest in new textbooks. They all want things to be online because they need to be updated quickly and they want to be able to pick and choose stuff. Very often, history teachers aren't necessarily history subject specialists in schools these days. Sometimes they are humanities teachers. They might be geographers. They might be supply teachers. So they need really careful help to underpin anything new that they do. Otherwise, it'll be very unfamiliar. We have increasing roles of academies and trusts in deciding what gets taught. So the ability of individuals to affect change is quite limited. People do perhaps tend to stick with their comfort zones and not perhaps look outside the box and think about global dimensions, so that's something else to have a think about. And there are a lot of concerns about tokenism, about just kind of putting one female case study in here and there. They don't want it to be just a token thing, they want it to be something that they can engage with, but they don't have the volume of examples that they need to bring into all the different topics on the syllabus. So, lots to think about there. So how does this all relate to what on earth I'm going to talk about today? I'm getting there, I promise. So for me as a researcher, this has also made me think really hard about, okay, what are the key things that we need to change? What are the big common misconceptions? Why is it that women still aren't really visible? And how can we make them visible? What are the key debates that we can kind of get people engaged with and thinking about? Broadly speaking, these are some of the things that we have been working on in relation to our continuing professional development sessions. So thinking about women in power, thinking about diversity and global Middle Ages. We've been thinking a lot more about material culture and also movement, which is going to be the theme of my talk today. I don't want to go into too much detail about all of these, but what I will say is it's fundamental that we, when approaching medieval women, really have get across that we need to change the way we perceive medieval power. We need to build on the work of people like Teresa Ehrenfeit, Ellie Woodacre, Amy Livingston, Kimberly Low-Pratt, and many, many others to challenge the idea that powerful women are exceptional. In doing so, we can draw on studies that look at their money and wealth. We can think about different types of rulership, hard and soft power, how people, what is power? Just getting students at schools to think about what is power and what makes someone powerful can be a really empowering experience in itself. I've been very privileged this week to have been having a chat with Heather Tanner, who some of you may be familiar with her work on Beyond the Exceptionalism Debate, which was a key kind of essay collection that came out in the last decade. And talking to her as well about why this was necessary. A group of scholars got together and kind of realised when you have so many examples of powerful women, at what point do they stop being exceptional and become the rule? So I think this is a key element that we can begin to get across. So critical mass of individual examples is really important to generate. Things that we also want to move away from are thinking about monarchy as being a sole effort, using terms like corporate monarchy to explain the shared relationship of power. Again, what Ehrenfeit calls the flexible sack of monarchy, where you can pretty much choose who's going to help you, whether it's an advisor, a family relative, all of those things, to carry out the stuff that you want to get done. We should also think about replacing the word agency when we talk about female power, because agency comes with it this kind of limiting factor that women have to prove that they are able to wield power. Whereas it's clear that some women's authority in the medieval period went uncontested and was accepted. Second, we need to make better use of the excellent scholarship that's already there on material culture and generate more materials for schools around objects. There's lots of supporting pedagogical evidence to say that kids really engage well with objects. So building on things like the fantastic exhibition has been really useful. We've been delivering CPD around the objects in the exhibition. Seals, in particular, as a way of kind of engaging kids with female power has been very successful. But patronage of architecture, working trades, their personal objects, music, all of these things have really been received well. Diversity of women's lived experiences in school histories also are needed to meet the challenges of intersectional inequalities. Here we can draw from great comparative work on the global Middle Ages, especially in terms of queenship. So there's a great collection of essays on global medieval queenship, edited by Ellie Woodacre. But we can also, through diversity, explore relationships between elites and non-elites. We can also think about health humanities, which is a kind of real kind of growth area, and involve women in that process. Lots of people went to the British Library exhibition and saw the fantastic disease woman and were inspired by this image and wrote about it afterwards. And now, on to the topic of today's lecture, which is movement. And so I'll focus on this for the rest of the time period. But for me, movement is about kind of generating a permanent shift away from the idea that women were successfully segregated from public life, or that they were simply stay-at-home women. There is no doubt that family, marriage, and domestic life are extremely important when understanding medieval women's lives and networks. But in the transition from academic to public histories, these are often very clearly distinguished from modern connotations of the nuclear home and household. The medieval household functioned as an economic unit and could support an extended network of relatives and retainers often. An elite society, that extended family network was fundamental to political alliances and relationships for both men and women. Rather than staying at home because of family, women were often expected to travel because of family. They left their natal homes on behalf of families in order to build new diplomatic and economic bridges through marriage. They took with them skills, cultural trends, new ideas, and once in situ, they had to build new connections and networks of support. Further, when it came to physical movement, although women's options in general may have been slightly more circumscribed than men, there were certain groups of both men and women in Latin Christian society whose movement was discouraged, from monastics who took vows of stability to serfs who needed permission to travel away from the Lord's land. And for those, the idea of literary travel and imagination travel is also an important way of exploring how they thought about movement in the medieval world. I can't possibly cover all of that today, so. But my title today was on dangerous journeys, and I think there's not much more of a dangerous journey you can go on than a crusade, so that's my justification. And it also comes from a title, the Peregrinatio Pericolosa of Margaret of Beverly, who I'm going to talk about quite a bit. And I think our perceptions about women and travel have also been coloured by this emphasis on the dangers of travel in surviving source material. As Kim Phillips has argued, dominant cultures of Latin Christendom valorised the settled, the agrarian and the urban, over the roaming, the nomadic and the cityless. And, to an extent, travel was perceived as a disruption to normative modes, rather than being comprehended as a permanent process. This sometimes manifested in the telling of cautionary tales, especially in monastic literature, and especially where female monastics were concerned, such as the story of the beautiful young abbess kidnapped and raped by Saracens during the Great German Pilgrimage of 1064-5, and various stories of hardships endured by women on crusade. However, similar concerns were raised about male religious when it came to pilgrimage, and they also faced censure when leaving the cloister. Cautionary tales or an emphasis on danger could be part of the spiritual suffering that came along with penitence, especially on a spiritual journey. So when looking beyond monastic culture, there's clear recognition that in certain circumstances, travel was necessary, appropriate, and even an act of devotion. So why did women travel in the medieval world? Well, social and economic factors often dictated population movement in the medieval period. Society was largely agrarian, with subsistence farming playing a key role. Domestic work and childcare certainly formed a major aspect of most women's lives. However, economic production from the home provided opportunities for women to move outside the domestic sphere as well. Rural women were involved in selling surplus produce, e.g. eggs, poultry, dairy produce, home-brewed ale, of course, we can't forget the ale, at markets and local towns. Townswomen too worked in a variety of businesses and trades, often operating through a household unit, and negotiated deals as well as facing censure if they traded unfairly. Unmarried women might leave their homes to enter the service of a wealthier household, and depending on their role, might be expected to travel with masters or mistresses. Floods, famines, diseases that affected crops and livestock could trigger demographic movements from villages to towns, or even bigger migrations to settle new areas. The stubbing roll that's in the British Library exhibition highlights a difference in daily pay received by male and female workers who might travel on a seasonal basis to gain extra income during harvest months. Extraordinary pandemics such as the Black Death and recurring plagues had a huge impact on local communities and families, wiping some villages completely off the map. And in those extreme circumstances, it's not really surprising that women, just as much as men, might seek out new lives in local towns or cities, or travel further afield to find new work. Sometimes travel was a necessity for certain types of jobs. In 1403, Joan de Lis, a medical practitioner, had to petition Henry IV for permits of safe travel, appealing for royal protection against those who might treat her with disrespect for practicing medicine. In the context of the Crusades, another medical practitioner, Hersender, travelled from Paris to Egypt with the Seventh Crusade, ministering to Louis IX of France, my apologies, when he was laid low with dysentery. Edelina, a midwife, received a bequest in the will of Isabella of Aragon, who died in 1271, pictured here. She was the wife of Philip III of France. She took part in the 1270 crusade to Tunis with her husband and was several months pregnant when she fell from her horse during the return journey, which triggered a miscarriage. She died shortly after giving birth. Thus, Edelina may have accompanied Isabella on crusade. We only know about her from the bequest. We don't know if she was present on the crusade, but presumably you would want a midwife with you if you were likely to give birth soon. Isabella's story illustrates some of the very real dangers posed by travel to women who are pregnant. And that while this was taken seriously, there were clearly times when the timing of a pregnancy could not be managed, or the travel was considered worth the risk. We can also think about travel in relation to family. So noble women attached to courtly households often travelled to visit widely dispersed estates, family members and ecclesiastical foundations to carry out the business of lordship. Emmeline of Chateaudun, for example, travelled north with her children to meet her husband and overlords in Chartres in order to make a gift to the Abbey of Marmoutier in the 1040s. Marriage in particular was a legitimate reason for travel and often signalled an entree into public life. When women married, they were expected to enter their husbands' households. The nuptial journeys they undertook often involved visiting families and allies en route and could be important opportunities for political introductions. After the marriage was agreed between Princess Joanna of England and William II of Sicily, she travelled with considerable pomp from the court at Winchester through France to meet the Sicilian fleet at Saint-Gilles near the Mediterranean coast in 1177. Her brothers, Henry the Young King and Richard the Lionheart, took personal care to escort her on different parts of the journey. Later, their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, personally brought Richard's fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre, out to him in Sicily in 1191. And Joanna, Berengaria and other noble women travelled with the Third Crusaders to Acre via Cyprus, dealing with shipwreck and attempted capture on the way. So more dangerous elements to the journey there. Following her refusal of a marriage with Saladin's brother, Joanna returned to southern France to marry Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, although this was not a happy match, and therein lies another tale. But the other example we have here is the wonderful Talbot Shrewsbury book. And this is kind of used as well to illustrate Margaret of Anjou's bridal journey, which became really famous, the stuff of legend for its incredible expense. We have very detailed accounts of the exorbitant costs involved in the journey and the nuptials. And this includes payment for the upkeep of a lion, which they have a skull in the if you see the lion skull in the that's what that's all about. So we know from the accounts that she was paying to feed a lion all the way through France so that she could give it to her husband as a present for their wedding. But then we also need to consider the sort of spiritual dimensions of travel and pilgrimage in particular. Of course, most people associate, and I think when people, especially people at Key Stage 3 who are studying kind of medieval religious life, they do monks and nuns. If they're lucky, they might do nuns. And living within a convent, of course, imposed significant restrictions on movement. But we mustn't forget that religion was also a key driver for women to travel. The desire to connect physically with the holy places was an immensely strong motivator. for travel to emerging pilgrimage shrines housing the holy relics of saints. The three most significant centres for spiritual journeys were, of course, Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and Jerusalem. But as the cult of saints blossomed throughout the period, increasing numbers of shrines and pilgrimage routes developed. With the association of pilgrimage with the sacrament of penance, the public performance of contrition for one's sins, this became a major factor in people's decision to undertake pilgrimage, but they could also be motivated by ill health, fertility, or other issues, and saints were believed to have this power to intercede on people's behalf. So there are lots of different reasons for engaging in pilgrimage. A lot of people just went on small-scale journeys to local shrines. Someone like Margaret Paston, who I think will be familiar to some of you, she promised to visit the Norfolk shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham when her husband John fell ill in 1443. Others, by comparison, travelled huge distances. According to the Greenlander saga, Gudrid not only took part in the Viking expedition that supposedly reached North America, she travelled from Iceland all the way to Rome and back in the 10th century. Others went repeatedly and travelled to several holy sites. So Bona de Pisa, who became a saint herself, made the journey to Santiago de Compostela 9 times. But it's really the popularity of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which reached new heights in the 11th century, that kind of kicks off the interest in protecting pilgrim traffic to the Holy Land. And in 1095, Pope Urban II called for an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem to recover the Holy City and help Eastern Christians, whom he described suffering terrible punishments at the hands of Seljuk Turks. There were also specific stories being circulated about pilgrims being attacked. In a movement that became known as crusading, large groups of men and women from all social levels, inspired by popular preachers, travelled over land and sea from across Europe, through the Balkans and into the Byzantine Empire, then on through Asia Minor to Jerusalem. Now, women took part in these expeditions from the First Crusade onwards, yet they still don't seem to pop up in textbooks very often. And I think when I kind of think about women and crusading, I tend to use this sort of taxonomy. I'm only really going to talk about the first group today, so thinking about female participants. But there is this issue about how we define female crusaders. Are they just pilgrims by any other name, or are they crusaders? What makes a female crusader? It's kind of a bit more of a difficult question to answer than for men. But for example, we don't have a separate word for crusading until the 13th century. So most often in the 12th century, crusades are just called pilgrimages or journeys or the business of God. And so also, the numbering of these big crusade movements, that's something that's been imposed really by historians after the fact. There was lots and lots of pilgrim traffic with people going to fight and people going to visit the holy places all the way through the 12th and 13th centuries. What we might call independent crusades. So, how we kind of see women involved in those expeditions is something I think that needs further consideration. My approach is to take a very inclusive definition to anyone who's travelling in relation to, in these arenas in the 12th and 13th centuries is likely, if not being involved in an actual crusade, supporting the crusade effort by economic support or other means. So for me, it's fair game. Anyone can be a female crusader. But we also, of course, need to think about women impacted by the Crusades and those at home who enable crusades and crusaders. So those are two other groups that we can really benefit from looking at. Now, crusades were clearly one of the most dangerous journeys that women or men could undertake. Baldwin of Boulogne, later King of Jerusalem, took his wife, Godfrey of Tosny, on the First Crusade, who died en route. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, went with his wife, Elvira of Leon-Castile, who had a baby on crusade, but outlived her husband to return to France. Despite the protection offered by an army, Death rates on crusade from warfare, disease and poor resources were high for both men and women. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis related that Emma, wife of Ralph de Gale, went on crusade with her husband and both of them perished in around 1100. Humberger of Le Puisay also lost her husband, Gualo of Chaumont-en-Vexin, while they were on the First Crusade. Emmeline, the widow of Fulbert of Bouillon, was sold into marriage with a Turkish mercenary after her husband was beheaded during their captivity. One of the few couples who actually came home together were Dodo of Caen-le-Granville and Hadvide of Chigny, who were so relieved at their safe return that they donated an ornate jewelled chalice and other gifts to the monastery of Saint Hubert en Ardennes. The call for the First Crusade also inspired the first of what became known as popular crusades, with contingents including high numbers of people from lower classes who were possibly seeking to migrate for socio-economic reasons. Peter the Hermit and other popular preachers were credited with whipping up mob enthusiasm, which resulted in the so-called People's Crusade of 1096. I say so-called because there were some nobles on it as well. But these were the Crusaders who massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland and attacked other Christians as they travelled through Hungary and the Byzantine Empire. In fact, the so-called People's Crusade has been shown to involve significant nobles, but as it met with early disaster in the expedition, the sins and the bad behaviour of participants, especially women, consorting with women, was used as an excuse for its failure. A few of these ordinary women were named by chroniclers. We do have reference to, on the First Crusade, unnamed women, such as a nun of St Mary of the Granaries, a courtesan, a prostitute, a woman, presumably a servant, who was killed at the tent of Beaumont de Taranto. And of course, we can't forget the story of the woman who decided to follow her goose on crusade, thinking it was filled with the power of the Holy Spirit. Chronicler Guibert of Nogent and Albert of Aachen clearly found this ridiculous, and Guibert snidely remarked that the woman should have cooked and eaten the goose instead of going on crusade. But there were some women who were treated with sympathy. So, and these are two that I will kind of focus a bit more on in detail. This lovely ivory cross is also on display in the British Library exhibition and belongs to Sybil of Flanders. Now, she was a regent, a Countess of Flanders. She was a regent at home for her husband Thierry during his first two crusade expeditions. While Thierry was away on the Second Crusade, at 7 months pregnant, she led an army on horseback against the incursions of Baldwin IV of Hainaut. However, once her son Philip was old enough to take over the reins, she was able to join her husband and travelled to the Holy Land with him in 1157. And when they were there, Thierry goes off and does his kind of military bit, and he's off fighting. She decides to stay in Jerusalem, and then she stays at the convent of Bethany, which had been founded by her stepmother, Queen Melisande of Jerusalem. Thierry comes back and says, right, time to go home, off we go. And she says, do you know what? I really quite like it here. I'm not going to go back to Flanders. And she stays. The king tries to persuade her to leave. The patriarch says, no, definitely this is where I want to be. And she lives out the rest of her days in Holy Land until she dies in around 1165. I think this wonderful example of the ivory cross that is said to have belonged to her, and the story about her kind of reasons for going on crusade, her decision to remain in the Holy Land, all suggest to me that this is a pious motivation for doing this. She may have just been fed up with Thierry, that's also possible. But I think that, and in the chronicles that describe this, she is treated with some sympathy. Bereavement, or the responsibility of fulfilling a dead husband's vow, could also inspire a woman to crusade, and for chroniclers to treat them a bit more nicely. A number of widows, such as Margaret of France, the widow of Bela III of Hungary, and Ida of Vornbach-Rattenberg, the widow of Margrave Leopold II of Austria, chose to spend their dowers financing their own crusade contingents. Margaret sadly died shortly after her arrival in Acre, while Ida's fate is less certain. Chronicler Eckhard of Ora asserted that she died in the Battle of Heraclea in 1101, while Albert of Aachen suggested that she was carried off into captivity. Such stories highlight wider perceptions about the dangers of crusading for women, but they offer limited details. To juxtapose against that, I want to talk a bit more about one woman who ends up as the main focus of her own pilgrimage account through her brother's source. So this is Margaret of Beverly in East Yorkshire. If anyone's ever been to Beverly Minster, there it is. And the details of her life were recounted in an elegiac poem by her brother Thomas, who had been in the circle of Archbishop Thomas Becket and later joined the Cistercian monastery of Fradmont in the Diocese of Beauvais in France. His preface describes how, as a traveller, Margaret was following in the footsteps of her own parents, as she was born in Jerusalem while they were on pilgrimage. They seem to have been reasonably affluent townspeople, Huon and Sibylla, and they travelled to Jerusalem mid-12th century, even though Sibylla was pregnant with Margaret. She gave birth in Jerusalem, and the family then made their way back to Beverly. Even that journey was treacherous, as Margaret's father was forced to defend them with a branch from wolves along the way home. Once back, their younger son Thomas was dedicated to a clerical life and became attached to the minster in Beverly, where Thomas Becket became provost in the mid-12th century. Thomas recounts how Margaret spent that adolescence in Beverly. She passed the time of her adolescence in Beverly, this emporium of her people, being at the time very well known for trade and on account of the liberty of the place. Indeed, relics are held there of the country's patron saint, namely John of Beverly, the county's patron saint, former Archbishop of York. And as the local people venerated the place with highest devotion, so within that area it is regarded as a refuge for the accused and fugitives in public. So we have this sense of Beverly being this kind of idyllic little town, but also quite a religious environment in which to grow up. Margaret seems to have had a role in the upbringing of her brother, perhaps because their parents passed away early. But once his future was assured, we are told that Margaret decided to revisit the place of her birth, Jerusalem. And she arrived just in time for the Holy City to be besieged by Saladin in 1187. We don't know much about her journey out, but it is possible that she travelled with a contingent under the control of Roger of Mowbray, a serial independent crusader who travelled to the Holy Land to fight 3 times. There were a number of calls for help from the Latin East in the late 1170s and 80s, and Patriarch Heraclius of Jerusalem was known to have travelled to England specifically on a recruiting mission in 1185. Roger probably left Yorkshire for the 3rd time in 1186, and he was captured at the Battle of Hattin, dying soon afterwards. So Margaret, whether she travels with him or not, ends up trapped for 15 days during Saladin's siege of Jerusalem. Her brother Thomas relayed her account in the first person, which gives it a real sense of immediacy. But we should be wary of treating this as reportage. You know, it's an elegiac poem. It's clearly been thought about and reframed. But she reported, she described herself as a furious female warrior, covered as befitting a man, and wearing a helmet in the likeness of a man. That helmet, however, was made out of a cauldron. I fashioned a man from woman, a stone pretending to be a sapphire. I learnt to conceal fear by fear, she says. She brought drinking cups to the soldiers on the walls and was permanently marked on the leg by shrapnel from an exploding millstone. Margaret's situation was undeniably dramatic, but it wasn't unusual for women to play auxiliary roles on crusade and during sieges. On the 5th Crusade, women of the camp were not only expected to carry arms, they could be excommunicated if they failed in their duty. They also killed a number of Al-Kamil's troops who fled from an abortive attack on Damietta in 1219. After the capture of the city of Jerusalem, Margaret was taken into slavery twice and redeemed by benefactors. Thomas explained how, having given what little money she had left over to free herself, she escaped. And when she had fled towards the city of Lachish as a safe place, having joined with a troop of foreigners, she was captured again for the confession of Christ and placed in chains for 15 months. When those days were completed, she was redeemed at Candlemas with all the other captives through the mediations of a most Christian citizen of Tyre. Thence, wandering through the vastest desert, she came to Antioch, to the sepulchre of the Blessed Margaret, fulfilling a vow. After a short time, she was besieged with the Antiochians by the army of Saladin, but, deploring to God, victory was lost, with the Christian men put to flight. She hastened to Tripoli, where, being then enriched with the spoils of destroyers, she was made vulnerable to a bondsman, and she was almost imprisoned. The plan was then to come to Acheron, as a dispute had arisen between the princes, namely the King of France and the King of England, and this is where Philip and Richard are falling apart at the Siege of Acre. Margaret later returns to the west with the forces from the Third Crusade, but she continued to travel. She hadn't had enough. She carries on. She goes first of all to Rome and then to Santiago de Compostela, before finally she comes to see her brother in the convent at Fardmont, and he doesn't recognise her. It's been so long since they saw each other. And she has to tell him the names of their parents, Juan and Sibylla, so that he recognises his sister. He then convinces her that really she should have had enough travelling by now and she should be a good girl and join a convent, which she does. And she enters into the convent of Montreuil, where she spends the next 18 years of her life until she dies around 1215. Now, this verse account that her brother wrote was probably intended for the nuns of her convent to reflect on the spiritual aspects of Margaret's experiences and to remember her. But I think she's such an interesting story, and she's often just kind of talked about as, you know, a woman fighting on crusade because of this role she plays in the Siege of Jerusalem. But in terms of her independence, her experiences as a slave and a pilgrim traveller in the East, I think complicate her story significantly. The religious vocation behind her decision to travel was clear, as she visited several other pilgrimage sites, including Rome and Compostela, and of course enters a convent. She was clearly well off enough that she had her own prayer book, so she must have been of a certain kind of status as a townswoman to be able to afford that. And if she had travelled out in 1186 with Roger of Mowbray's contingent, that would have offered her significant additional protection, making her journey a bit safer, at least until she got to the point where Saladin turned up with his army. So I think, you know, she has this, she clearly has the means and the motive and the ability to travel. But then she has these two periods of captivity, during which she was reliant on charity and divine aid to get through. And this demonstrates too that independence could easily be taken away by the fortunes of war. I'm just going to check on the time because I couldn't see a clock in the room, but I'm going to see how I'm doing. Okay. So the last little bit that I wanted to kind of touch on, of course, is restrictions on movement, because not everybody could travel around. But at what point can restrictions on movement also be something that makes you powerful? Sometimes powerful women are deliberately confined or exiled. Restrictions on their movement suggest that if they had been free to move, they might become a threat or accrue political power. Famously, Eleanor of Aquitaine was imprisoned for almost 16 years for supporting her children to rebel against Henry II in 1173. But even confined, women could exert power and influence. The Byzantine princess Anna Komnena was placed in a convent following a failed coup in which she had tried to remove her brother John from the throne. It was from here that she wrote the Alexiad, a powerful history cementing her own and her father's imperial credentials and demonstrating her own educational prowess. I won't go into like the vocational choice for convent as a sort of voluntary restriction in the scope of this paper, because it would take too long. But if I were to mention one example in connection to the Crusades, that would be Countess Ella of Salisbury, who also had a very active political life. She was a sheriff, but she voluntarily gave up considerable secular authority to enter the nunnery that she founded, Laycock Abbey, and in part this was to help finance her son William to take part in the Barons' Crusade. Of course, slavery was also present in medieval society. The taking of captives was a common feature of medieval warfare. If a captive was of considerably high status, they might be ransomed, but for those without sufficient wealth, slavery could be an outcome. Theoretically, Christians were not supposed to enslave other Christians, but the status of free and unfree people varied across Europe, with practices such as serfdom being commonplace in some areas. Slave markets flourished, especially around the Mediterranean, where interactions with those who followed different faiths or different types of Christianity viewed as heretical allowed for a lucrative trade in permissible slaves. The Iberian traveller Ibn Jubayr described the plight of Muslim slaves carrying out hard labour in the Holy Land, including women in leg irons. Islamic law permitted the taking of slaves either in warfare or through purchase. Author Ibn al-Athir had a female Frankish slave who had been captured at Jaffa in 1187, and also described the reunion of two Frankish sisters who found each other after having been taken captive by different masters. But very often there's very little concrete evidence about what happened to individuals after they were taken into slavery. Examining trade networks and slave markets does provide some clues, and I think historians are working towards this. There's a couple of really good sort of collections of essays on pre-modern slavery in recent years. But from the British Library exhibition, we had two really fascinating documents. We only know about Marta, an enslaved Rus woman from this surviving bill of sale, where she was sold in 15th century Venice, and also in 1490s England, Maria Moriana, whose surname indicates that she may have been a person of colour, launched a legal case against her Italian master, Filippo Cine, who had planned to sell her as a slave in London. She said, "No, I don't want to be sold, and if you're going to sell me, I'd like you to pay me the back pay, please, that you owe me for the last 20 years, which he didn't take very kindly to. But the fact was that she was able to launch an appeal to the Court of the Chancery. So, and we also see sometimes in wills that slaves could earn or be offered manumission as an act of charity, and in some circumstances they could rise to positions of great power, especially in the Islamic world. The Mamluk dynasty, who assumed control of Egypt in the mid-12th century, began as Turkish slave warriors, trained from birth as elite troops to protect important rulers. A key figure in their rise to power was Shajar al-Dur, herself a Turkish slave. She started as a concubine to As-Salih Ayyub, the ruler of Egypt, but after providing him with a son, was promoted to become his wife. Widowed in the turmoil surrounding the arrival of Louis IX's crusade, Shajar conspired with Mamluk generals to depose the new heir, Turan Shah, taking power herself and acting briefly as sultana. And these are two of the gold dinars that are also on display in the British Library exhibition. To secure her position, she married the Mamluk general Aybak, and they ruled together for some years, but after a while relationships began to break down. She arranged for the death of her husband in 1257 and was killed in retaliation by followers of his son. But the mausoleum she built still remains in Cairo today as a lasting testament to her power and authority. So, there my case studies end. I think what I want to get across from that is that the medieval period was a dynamic time of social and cultural change. We have differing social, cultural, religious and economic factors that have huge impacts on women's movement, and this heightens as global connections increased because of that travel. In many respects, women themselves could be agents of that change, as they took part in and engaged in local and international marriages, bringing entourages, new ideas, customs to the courts of the elite, this cultural capital, and all of this kind of filtered into cultural life more broadly. They did not just fulfill their family lives at home. They journeyed on behalf of their families for spiritual and secular purposes. They migrated with them and sometimes pursued personal goals, though they could also suffer devastating losses of home and family through forced travel. But I think using this framework of movement to get people thinking differently about medieval women especially at schools, could be a really powerful way of doing so. And to finish up, I just want to show you a slide with some feedback. What do teachers need from us, historians? I think, so one of the things that we're trying to do with the project is to generate resources that can be slotted into different topics. And most of the time those tend to be individual focused narratives that work well with younger students. They like people's life stories, they like biographical elements. You can do some thematic stuff, but I think biographies and objects, material objects, are kind of two ways in. Context and interpretation for the primary sources that we provide. If people don't know how to use them, they're just going to sit there. So we need to kind of be really helpful with those types of things. We also need interpretations, key interpretations. So thinking about a framework, a way in which someone can introduce say 2 or 3 different historians' ideas, maybe even a female historian's ideas. To a younger audience, so that they understand how and why our interpretation of these things has changed over time. We're working on maps. I know I haven't presented any today, but so developing geographical context, that visual thing is really important. Podcasts, both for students and teachers, but they need to be short. They don't have lots of time to listen to a big hour-and-a-half long discussion. They really want something that gets straight to the point. When delivering reading, we need to think about pitching stuff at different levels. Not every student is going to be able to go at the same pace. So we need to have a space for different levels, support literacy, and also engaging with different types of objects, using role play. All of those types of things is important. And also making things accessible. So try to be engaging, don't dumb it down too much, getting it right for students at different ability levels, and maybe glossaries and terminology, sometimes pronunciation when it comes to global topics. So I'll leave it there, and I'd like to, we've got plenty of time for questions, I think, so that'd be great. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thanks, Natasha. That was really fascinating. We've got sort of 20, 25 minutes or so for questions. So if people put their hand up, we'll pass the mic around. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that amazing lecture. I didn't quite catch the name of the person who wrote the Beyond the Exceptionalization debate. Heather.
This is Heather Tanner. Well, it's actually it's an edited collection of essays. So there's lots of different scholars contributing to that body of work. But yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that really fascinating talk. And I'm an optimist like you, but recently I've been studying something that's made me a bit more pessimistic about women in medieval society.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are 2 points that one might make. One is, of course, that the sources we have tend to be written by men. Mm-hmm. Except a very few like Marjorie Kemp, which gives us clerical men who tend to have a particular bias, in the way, as you mentioned with Thomas, the brother. But I happen to be studying at the moment a rather unattractive subject, which is, as probably many of people here know, that under the statute of treasons in England, women who committed treason, which included petty treason, which was killing your husband, were burnt, whereas men were hanged if they committed petty treason. And I don't know, women were burnt, probably 1 or 2 a year, I mean, as far as the records. And then that led me to think, why do you burn women, but you hang men? What is it about women that leads society to feel the need to burn them? And I think that's fear. And I think the element of fear of women is something that you have to take account of when we study medieval women. And just as a footnote, you know that the burning of women continued as a punishment in this country until it was abolished by Parliament in 1790. And there were people being burnt in London in the 18th century.
My
Women were being burnt.
Oh, God, that's a shocker. Well, yeah, no, absolutely. It's a pessimistic thought, and absolutely, what I don't want to do, like, as I was saying, I don't want to dumb things down so that like students suddenly have an incredibly rosy picture of what medieval life was like for women. They would all just gallivanting off, having a great time. No, I do thoroughly understand this idea of the fear of women. It's implicit throughout a lot of Crusade literature, because the big thing that they were really afraid of was that women would tempt men into sexual sins, and they would lose a crusade because they'd made God angry by being sinful. So always when reading through those sources, you have to get through that layer first in order to kind of get to the... I mean, I think it's possibly given that level of fear and suspicion of women's activity that I'm surprised when they are sometimes sympathetic, to people like Margaret of France, or somebody like Margaret of Beverly, who, well, clearly it was her brother writing about her. But I think also there is, I think we should also kind of see restrictions as applying to both men and women. And it comes into the kind of way in which they deal with things like clerical masculinity in Crusade texts as well. That male clerics, only a certain type are supposed to be on crusade, and certainly monastics should not be there either. And there's talk about them kind of throwing off their habits and bringing everybody into disrepute. So I think that there is a balance to be drawn. The problem, as ever, when trying to convert this from an academic debate into a schools-focused one, is what level of complexity can you deliver? I think that at the moment the picture is just too pessimistic. So we need to have something there to kind of balance it out and give people something inspiring to kind of balance it with. Yes.
Thanks. Hi. Thanks for the talk. It was great and really interesting. So you've sort of demonstrated that there's a wealth of stories of women traveling and being involved in life and blah, 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 and it goes beyond what I guess we think of. So where does that popular narrative come from? Like, where have we gone wrong, shall we say?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess... I think that partly it's to do with this kind of misconception of home and household, and people think, and I think, when people were initially even looking at women's studies, kind of in the 70s, there was a real concept that the past was a time of, well, not always a time of oppression, but they could that almost that there's like a continuation where the past was really oppressive and now things are getting better and better and they will gradually improve. As we know, it's not really like that. It's all swings and roundabouts, and those rights that you fight for, you have to carry on fighting for in order to keep them going. So, and it's not the same geographically. Across the globe, women's situation is different everywhere. So I think it's partly to do with that kind of, those early forays into scholarship where people were dividing things out into public and private and trying to find routes into women's lives to find out more about them. But actually it's become a little bit restrictive now. We have lots and lots more case studies which challenge those ideas. So I think we need to kind of keep building critical mass and keep getting the names of individuals and stories out there to make people aware. And there's no reason why we can't have a 50-50 curriculum of historical topics. You're always selecting what history is important. So why is it that we're still not selecting women as important on the history curriculum?
Oh, loads of hands. Asha, I think did you put your hand up last time?
Probably.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm doing a master's at Royal Holloway, and I've been taught by Andrew Dashitsky, who's teaching me Women in the Crusades, the module that you created, and I used to be taught by Jonathan Phillips 20 years ago. There are two questions I want to ask. So yesterday I was in Founders Dining Hall with a couple of colleagues from my class, and they were very despondent because we haven't got to the point of the Queens, of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and where are the sources at? You know, how can we talk about how women on the ground are living their lives during the Crusades? And I think that's just the nature of medieval history. That's one question. My second question is what I'm going to do my essay on, which is on Melisende. So I need to get your feedback,
okay.
which is what challenges did Melisende face as Queen of Jerusalem, and how did she overcome them? If you can outline them, that can help me for my essay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, seeing as you've got Jonathan Phillips sat next to you, I'll let you. Okay. So finding out about women on the ground in the Crusades. Yes. So less of the elite women and more of the. I think, as with everything, it's a very piecemeal effort trying to put together all of the different stories. I think finding out about non-elites on Crusade in general is quite tricky. We know lots about powerful noblemen. We know a bit about some of the powerful noblewomen who take part. We know much less about what they actually did while they were in the Holy Land, because they don't come up in the Chronicles. What the guys do is all focused on the military events. So if they're involved in military activity, then we hear a bit more about them. Looking at other evidence, looking at charters, looking at patronage, if there's any evidence of them donating stuff. Looking at their lives longer term and seeing how the crusade fits into their pattern of movement through their lives. So thinking about, were they donating before they went? Sybil of Flanders, for example, you could easily miss that one little section in the Heracles Chronicle which describes her entrance into the convent at Bethany. But if you look at her whole life and the way in which she's involved as a regent, you look at the material culture, the ivory cross, which says, I'm really religious, all of those things, then suddenly you can begin to build, this is a female crusader, in my view. She's an independent crusader who ends up entering a convent in the Holy Land, which in many respects is a big act of devotion that other crusaders didn't manage. They all went back home and carried on with their lives. So, but that said, so those lower down the social scale, we always have to be wary of general references to women, but at the same time they are there, and the references to them aren't always, like I said, some of them are sympathetic. Sometimes we see them in auxiliary roles. I'd like to know more, wherever new sources come up, I'm always keen to find out more. I think we can do a lot more with the source on Margaret of Beverly. Finding out more about those is definitely on the agenda for me.
Can you speak about Melisende, sorry?
Sorry?
Speak about Melisende.
Oh, and Melisende. Well, what are the challenges for Melisende?
What are the challenges for Melisende?
Well, it's better than the question that I got at third year from somebody in the audience about Melisende, which is dynamic but disruptive. Is this an accurate assessment of women's contribution to life in the medieval period? So, her main challenges, I think she dealt with most of her challenges pretty darn well. She had to negotiate with family members. She was in a corporate monarchy situation. She inherited both with her husband and son, and she had to negotiate with that. But she's a really good patron. She knows what she's doing. She's very experienced. She's got good support from the nobility. The one thing I think she did a bit badly, she wasn't great at choosing personal advisors. She did a bad job with Hugh of Jaffa, her cousin. She relied on him too much, and Manasseh of Liège. Nobody liked him. So there we go. In a nutshell.
There were lots more answers.
Thank you. It's in reference to women being absent from contemporary historical narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the Muslim side you mentioned Ibn Jubair and Ibn Asir, and I think some of these scholars were more focused on what was happening to the Muslims themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were deeply concerned that there was this hostility or animosity between the Abbasids in Baghdad and the Fatimids in Egypt. and also the Turkish rulers of Anatolia and Damascus were very much divided. I think the contemporary Arab or Muslim chronicles are more focused on intra-Muslim issues, and that's why they generally don't use the word Christian for the Crusaders. They call them Franks, not because they came from France, but simply they were foreigners. This is a Frank or foreigner. So I think that was largely because you had this hostility, then you have the assassins coming in, and then you have the Mongols invading. So this was a kind of era, the medieval era, where the attention was more focused on invasion. Marco Polo, I mean, that would be an interesting source, because Marco Polo worked with the Mongols, and his last journey, he was actually bringing a Mongol princess for the Khakan in Persia. So by the time he reached Isfahan, that Khakan had died. So the Mongol princess came all the way from China to marry this chap in Persia. So there is this Mongol connection, and so quite a bit of international movement. But you're very right that one does notice absence of women from these narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks. That's great. Lots to unpack there. But essentially, I totally take your point that basically the Crusaders were pretty unimportant in the Arabic world at the time. They were a bit of a blip. They weren't necessarily taken, they weren't the main focus. And so one of the things, because obviously, the Crusades is taught to younger people at school, but we want the Crusades to be more diverse when we come to teaching it, and looking for examples of different Islamic women whose lives are affected by crusading. We can't necessarily put a finger on, okay, this individual was leading an army, doing this, that, and the other against the Crusaders. But what we can do is we can look at women like Zumurrud of Damascus, who's a complete contemporary of Melisande in the 1130s, who is basically running the show in Damascus for a while after she gets widowed. She even kills her own son in favour of another one. She's a hardcore ruler. We've got Queen Arwa in Yemen. Now, she is a really fascinating example. She ruled in her own right for 40 years without too much interference from Egypt. And although she's not directly connected to crusading, you can bring her into crusading history, because if the Crusaders hadn't kept everybody busy up north, she might have faced more hassle from the Seljuk Turks. And there's a connection, of course, between Yemen and Egypt at this time, and you even have a female regent writing to Arwa, a female regent in Egypt writing to Arwa. So you've got letters between female rulers in the Islamic world, which is just, there is information there. So it's about selecting those case studies and bringing them into the history to make their presence known, I think. I think that's the thing we need to do if we're going to try and get a broader, more global picture. And the Mongol Khatums are also on the radar, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, we can do a double question. It was a question about faith and about teaching medieval history, and how you engage with younger people who don't really understand religious faith, because most of the things that motivate these women has got to do with their piety. And the second question actually follows a little bit from Iftikhar's question as well, which is, how then do you teach in a classroom these Western European sources in which Muslims are presented so negatively?
Okay. Yeah, so two things to think about there. I mean, to be fair, for the most part, I'm not often the one who's on the front line teaching the school children in school. I mean, I go in and give talks, but it's the teachers that we work with who are doing those things. And we've asked similar questions to them, how do you manage these situations? What do you do? I mean, in respect of faith, I had some really great feedback the other week about someone who came to our British Library CPD session on women and religion. And they decided to do a class on anchorites. And they just sort of threw it totally out in the open and said, why would anyone want to do this? Why would they want to live this life? Why would you want to just shut yourself away, only be fed for a whole, just not do anything apart from think about God? Why on earth? And so, they had to think about it. And then finally, one of the male students came round to it and said, right, okay, I've got it. So I am a modern day anchorite. My faith is the Xbox. My mum is my servant who puts everything through the door. I mean, okay, that's maybe not quite what we were looking for, but I think it's about finding those frames of reference, like, you know, starting with a, you know, why would, thinking about why someone would do something, I think it was a really good way into thinking about medieval religiosity and belief. But I appreciate, and obviously there's going to be very different approaches. You mentioned about obviously dealing with negativity about different religions and different sources, and of course we do have that in Christian sources, but that's why we try to use Islamic sources as a balance wherever we can, Byzantine sources, Eastern Christian sources, we use Sunni and Shia sources, we use, you know, a variety of different approaches so that there is some equity in those things, and we try and make sure that we teach from diverse perspectives, always.
Thank you very much for your lecture. That was wonderful. I've got both an observation and a question. The observation dates from the Royal Historical Society's 150th anniversary. Katie Cubitt looked at who had won the Society's Article Prize in the first decade of its existence. And what she found was that it was more than 50% women, and that many of them were writing on medieval history. So I think you may actually have something to draw from there in your desperate historiographical lacuna of women, where you could go back much further than you would think. Yes, now, my question comes from discussions we had in that time period with AQA, EdXL, and OCR. AQA in particular argued it was difficult to get women into the curriculum because it was difficult to examine social history. So one of the things I love about what you've said is you've put women back in politics. And I think that if they're arguing it's easier to examine politics, going through power, politics, dynasty, monarchy might be a first route in to getting women into the curriculum. So that's just my comment question.
Oh, that's great, thank you. I mean, absolutely. I mean, you know, there is a... In the first instance, I hope that I didn't come across as saying there's no historiography. Of course, there's so much historiography there. I'm just amazed that the female historians who've made such a profound impact on, you know, my life and others just kind of still aren't getting a look in when it comes to this. And second of all, absolutely yes. I think a key step, if we, you know, well, what do they mean you can't examine social history? But anyway, but aside from that excuse, absolutely getting women back into the politics, but also expanding what politics is, what power is. You know, not all power is just you can't just write a law and expect everyone to obey it. You know, what are the mechanisms behind that? You have to kind of, so yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the big ways in which we're hoping to get people to recognise this.
Thanks for an amazing lecture, Natasha. I'm struck by your comment about how can decades of work on medieval women still not be showing up in the curriculum, and I share that when I teach, or you know, have students come to university and I teach a later period of women's and gender history. And then I was struck by your comment about that young man who mentioned his mum as a servant. And we're battling, aren't we, with the reproduction of gender stereotypes, which with children and young people still hold. And that's what makes your work really important. But my question was about power and agency. You split them up and you ditched one and you ran with the other. It struck me that lots of the women that you were talking about in the movement part of the lecture, the women who are travelling, actually seemed to me to be displaying agency rather than power. If you think about agency as the capacity to make decisions for yourself, and power perhaps is something that you exercise over others. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about agency, because you ditched it. It's a concept I use quite a lot when I think about women.
Well, I think this is something that's come out of work by Theresa Ehrenfeit in particular for me. But the idea is that, I think absolutely. So I'm sort of ditching agency perhaps in favour of independence, which maybe, you know, to demonstrate independence. But I think the concern is if you use, why is it that when we talk about men, we talk about power? Men were powerful, but when we talk about women, they had agency. agency to me suggests that first, before we can think about women having power, we have to think about whether they were able to have power, if that makes sense. And then that's already limiting women's power by doing that. Because absolutely, there were some women in medieval society who their power was unquestioned, uncontested. They were, or even when it was contested by sons, for example, they just knocked them out of the park, like Clements of Flanders. So, so I think rather than like putting that first barrier in place by saying, well, oh, it was a bit difficult for them, but did they manage to overcome all of these troubles and do it? I think we should just say, no, they were powerful and they knew how to use power. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it's a great point to end on. Thanks, Natasha. Before we thank Natasha again for her wonderful talk, I just want to let you know about the next 2 Royal Historical Society events coming up. So in just under a month's time, on Wednesday the 5th of March, we're going to be holding our annual History and Archives in Practice conference with our partners, the National Archives and the Institute of Historical Research. This year, the event is going to be here in central London at the Institute of Historical Research in Senate House. Registration is open and the conference is free to attend. It's going to be a really great event, so I thoroughly recommend that. And then I also recommend the next in our series of Royal Historical Society lectures. We'll be back here on Friday the 2nd of May when we've got a paper by the historian of early modern England, Mark Stoyle from Southampton, entitled Remembering Rebellion in the Tudor Southwest. And if anybody has read his book, you'll know that you don't want to miss this lecture. And full details of Mark's lecture and other events later in the year will be announced very soon on the Society's website. And as usual, all of the events are free, they're open to the public. Please make sure to register for them on our website, where you can find out details of future events as well. But for now, I'd like to finish the evening by offering our very sincere thanks to Natasha again. Thank you.